the commonality when they describe their story and their help from their parents was not the opportunity that they had had, but how hard their parents had worked.
Yeah.
So now people will defer to their parents' working class roots rather than their middle class status.
So good afternoon, everybody. For those that don't know me, I'm Rachel Tudor. I'm a trainee here at Mishcon in the corporate tax department. Thanks everybody for joining today. Dr Eliza Filby is a contemporary historian and of generational change. She advises organisations around the world through Marula, her research practice, exploring shifts in work, wealth and values. Eliza writes for The Times on money and wealth and for City AM on the future of work. She also hosts the podcast It's All Relative. She published her first book, God and Mrs Thatcher, The Battle for Britain's Soul, in 2015 and published Inheritocracy, It's Time to Talk About the Bank of Mum and Dad, in September 2024, which went on to become a Sunday Times bestseller. So Eliza, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Pleasure, pleasure.
So one of the first things that really struck me when I was reading Inheritocracy is just how much it really related to my life and to my friends, to my family, whether that's my cousins who are relying on their parents for help with childcare, or a friend of mine that's mysteriously bought a house all of a sudden, or some of my friends that are still living with their parents. For those people that haven't read the book In the Room, can you summarise what Inheritocracy is?
Yes, so it's a kind of made-up word that is deliberately provocative, and the theory behind it is this idea of we're creating a society where increasingly it's not what you earn, because wages don't buy us what they bought our parents. It's not what you learn, because the return on the investment of education is declining. It's whether you have access to the bank of mum and dad that is determining whether you have certain opportunities or not. And I wanted to call it that because I wanted people to reflect on this force in society that to a large degree is benign, right? The family, it's about helping one's loved ones and supporting one's loved ones. But it's also actually become such a powerful economic force that it's really shaping our society. And it's the complete opposite of what potentially we think we live in, which is a meritocracy.
Yeah. So can you explain, for those people in the room, what that means for intergenerational and intragenerational differences? Because I'm sure I'm not alone in being the person around the table that's saying to my parents, oh, you had it way easier than I did. But it's not just about that anymore. It's also about the differences between me and my friends or me and my peers. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that it's a memoir, right? It's an embarrassing memoir where I was just kind of determined to talk about how my parents had helped me. Because there's no way that I could write a book about the bank of mum and dad and not admit that I was a product of the bank of mum and dad, right? So, and at the root of it was actually this desire to open up the conversation, because a lot of friendship groups, certainly a lot of families, and actually a lot of politicians don't talk about it. I interview several people in the book. It's not just my story, it's lots of different people whose story is told. Some had help from the Bank of Mum and Dad, others haven't. But one consistent thread was how no one wanted to talk about it openly. And how, I remember one woman I interviewed said to me, I don't want rich friends. I don't want Nepo babies as friends, because I know that I would just take such sort of umbrage at the fact that I've had to work really hard to get where I am, and perhaps some of my friends that were Nepo babies wouldn't. And she was really harsh, but also incredibly honest. And I think one of the things that I wanted to spark with this book was this conversation of how this has come about. And the central thesis of the book is that actually the baby boomers are the exception. We've been trying to sort of chase, if you like, what they had. And they had access to three things. We haven't, essentially. Anyone under the age of 45 has not had access to the same rising wages, has not had access to the same level of affordable housing, and has not had access to the same decent pensions. And those are three things that the baby boomers have had. Not all, okay? It's important to not overgeneralize. But the previous generation before them didn't have either. So they are a weird kind of anomaly. Now, Gen X, the generation after them, who's potentially your parents may be as well, have had it, but saw a closing door on pensions, saw a massive economic fallout after the 2008 financial crisis, and had slightly higher house prices. But they too have had this economic windfall. And so what's happened really since the 1980s is this massive build-up of wealth, unparalleled, completely unprecedented build-up of wealth in the older generations. And it's in property, obviously increasing asset prices. It's in pensions, okay? Half of the boomers' wealth is in pensions, not just in property. And what's happened is that you now have 1 in 5 baby boomers in the UK as a millionaire, right? So this huge disproportionate amount of wealth in that generation. And then after 2008, this generation called the millennials and Gen Z, enter the workplace where wages basically stagnate, right? Not in law. Law and private equity, by the way, are the 2 professions that have kept apace with house prices. But still, it's still very expensive to be young, right? Particularly in London. And what happened post-2008 to the economy is with quantitative easing, what happens when you have quantitative easing, the asset prices rise. And also you had certain other things become more expensive as well. Education becomes ever more expensive, as we know. The price of that degree went up, and as more and more of us got degrees, the value of that degree goes down, right? So the return on that investment. And now it's a 40-year graduate tax. It's not a loan, it's a tax, right? And also childcare became ever more expensive. So this weird kind of evolution happened that as house prices, as education, as childcare, big ticket items in life became more and more expensive, you suddenly got this rise of the bank of mum and dad, because young people were reliant on their parents to either stay at home so they could build a deposit, help with a deposit, help with rent, help with tuition fees, help with the cost of education, now help with childcare. And those that did not have that parental support were quite often frozen out of the housing market, potentially frozen out of the rental market, particularly in London, find that they spend more each month on their childcare costs than their mortgage, if they have one, and also have a debt, educational debt, if they made it to university, for life. So it's this huge intergenerational disparity between very wealthy older and struggling young, but then within the young, the ones that are making it, or frankly managing it, I should say, are the ones that have the dependency of mum and dad. And when we wrote the book, we did some brilliant polling asking people, do you think we live in an inheritocracy? And 63% of under 45 said, yes, we do. 40% of over 45 said, we do. So there's also older generations don't quite understand what's happened.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many parents this book has been bought for. Going, look, Mum, it's been really shit while I've been young, compared to your youth. And I think there is that kind of, it's like we haven't quite understood what's happened. The market's become dysfunctional, the state has retracted, the family has stepped up. And the divide is between those that have that can be a safety net and a leap, and those that don't.
So what does that mean for education? Because I'm definitely not alone in, parents saying you need to work hard at school, you need to get good grades, you need to make sure you go to a good university, not for value of education in and of itself, but also so you can go far in life and you can achieve what you want to achieve. What does inheritocracy mean for education and for social mobility?
I think we grew up in, I'm a lot older than you, so let's say we grew up in the same era. I think the 80s and 90s when I was at school was very much about get to university, and particularly girls. For a long time, the education system undervalued, undermined women. And then we started to beat the guys. And in the 1990s, women started to outnumber men at university, and that has been the story ever since, right? In the educational race, women have won, well and truly. Even now, increasingly in STEM subjects, where traditionally they haven't. But the key thing is that we believed that we lived in a meritocracy. And this idea also that education meant opportunity. So if I was diligent and conscientious, and I was the first person in my family to get a degree, so I was very much indoctrinated in this idea of get to university, do that thing. I went to university and never left, right? I did a BA, MA, PhD. I really was on the educational track, right? I really did believe it. And this is where the book is wholly personal, because I realised that I could do all the education, literally, there was to be done. And by my early 30s, I was a university lecturer on £12,000 a year with a part-time cleaning job and no security in my job, no money in my job, and still dependent, very fortunately, for a London base because my mum had bought a 5-bedroom house in Tooting for 28 grand and let me stay in it. And it was a building site, but she let me stay in it. So basically, I was only able to do a PhD because of my mum and dad. I was only able to afford to live in London because of my mum and dad. I was still going around there stealing toilet roll and eating Sunday dinner. Like, I was like, hang on a minute. Like, I've done all this education stuff and it literally has led me not down the path of financial. Well, I should have become a lawyer, obviously, but I didn't. But it was this sort of reckoning of, oh, hang on a minute, there's a really important thing happening here, which is education is important. We know that we have a sink or swim education culture in this country where you either sink or swim, and for those that sink, there's not a lot. There's not a lot. It's changing a bit, but not really.
Not enough.
Like the T levels and all of that, and the apprentices in this country have been completely obliterated. But even for those that succeed in the education system, the cost of it, they have to carry, unlike any other previous generation. But not just the cost of the tuition fees, but like the cost of university accommodation has increased by 18% since 2020. Like even doing the degree is now such a burden, not only on the individual, but increasingly on the parents. So the cost of the education is forcing, I think, Gen Z to have a different conversation than millennials did. When I was at university, we were all having a good time, you know, not really thinking about money, certainly not really thinking about the debt. Tuition fees were £1,000 a year, right? I'm that old. By the time I was teaching at university, they'd gone to 9,000 a year, and students were seeing themselves as customers. And I got out of higher education before the lockdown, COVID, which really changed the conversation because they were like, this is basically crap YouTube. Why am I paying £9,000 for this? So that conversation was even more intensified where they're like, what's the return on this investment? Because this is going to saddle me with a 50k debt for the rest of the next 40 years.
I think last time I checked, I was on like 68 grand.
And that's if if you do a master's, it's even more profound. So the conversation around education has evolved. Now, you've seen different choices of degree. So more STEM subjects, fewer English or foreign language degrees, for example. I think that might change now with AI. You know, it was, 7 years ago, it was all like, be a coder. That's a secure job. It's not anymore. So I think also you've got the rise of self-education and MOOCs and the ability to learn outside of the university education system, sometimes for free. So I think the conversation is now progressing in a way that it's not like get a degree, you're on a path. It's why are we saddling 21-year-olds with debt for life that's not going to actually provide them with an education or a qualification for life, for a working life that potentially will have to be like up until your mid-70s?
Yeah.
And so the conversation is, in the age of AI, we're going to have to stay agile. We're going to have to keep learning. We're going to have to outpace AI, frankly. And is that education that we got at 21 really going to facilitate that? And so I think that's where we're not there yet. But one of the interesting stats in the book, which is a poll that was conducted on millennial parents, so asking them about their kids, who are not at university yet, of course. And just 12% of millennial parents think their kids should go to university.
That's really low statistic.
It's really low.
Yeah.
Why? Is it because they think their kids are not bright enough? No. It's because they're not, having done that track, convinced by it for the next generation that they're now, raising. And so I think the conversation will move quite quickly around the financial model, around the academic model. It's crazy how much ChatGPT is forcing this because most education now is basically done on ChatGPT. So I think even since I've written the book, it's not just Inheritocracy that's influencing the conversation around education. It's also the fact that learning is learning by rote, stuff that basically now
it's gone out the window.
Yeah.
So this changing conversation, as someone who's at the very early stages of their career, What does this mean for the future of work?
I think, and I write and think a lot about this, and for anyone interested, I wrote a Substack called Career Advice for My 7-year-old. I think the first certainty is you're looking at a much longer working life, and that's not because we're all much poorer than our parents, but I think we want to work longer, right? I think you're definitely looking at a multi-stage career in which you're not going to have one career. Gen Z, it's been estimated, will have around 7 different careers.
7 feels really high.
7 feels very high. Probably in law, fewer. But
Pick the
if
right
I
horse.
think about my mum, she worked for the same company her entire life. So she changed kind of roles in that company, but she worked for the same. We know that model's dead. And then if I look at, people that are sort of 15 years ahead of me, most of them have had the same career. That model's gone. I'm 45 and I've had 3 distinct phases in my career that are very different, very different. And I think that is becoming the norm. I think it's important to say that is a privilege as well. One of the things that the Bank of Mum and Dad has financed a lot is career changes. The quarter-life crisis. My sister went from working in TV to being a midwife. That was, funded basically by
I
Mum
think
and
my
Dad.
brother's thinking about a career change and he'll be moving back to Birmingham and living back with my mum.
And I think when I say bankrolled by Mum and Dad, I don't mean like your mum and dad is giving your brother a load of cash. It's just that my sister was able to be a midwife student and live at home. So I think multi-stage careers. I think we're going to have to self-educate more and pay for our upskilling more, because companies don't pay for you to change your career. They actively want you to stay in the same career. And even when you're in that career, they very rarely, unless you're sort of leader signposted, you're not invested in at all. And I think the state isn't going to pay for you to change your career either, because it's not even going to pay for you to get out of the education system. In fact, you've got to pay it. So I think one of the things that will typify Gen Z's careers is that you're going to start paying, really investing in your self-education. And you already see this. I mean, I can't count the number of times I sit on the tube and I look over at someone else's phone and they're learning. They're not watching, Married at First Sight like I am. They're learning to code or whatever. Probably not code.
That doesn't
but
quite
probably
fit. Yeah.
Prompt. They're learning to prompt. So I think there's that self-taught, self-educated, self-enhancement. I think is going to be huge. And I think also we're going to have to really manage our careers with our caring responsibilities. And I'm not talking just about kids here, I'm talking about ageing parents. And there's a whole chapter in the book about this, but I've become ever more sort of evangelical about this, is that we're living in an ageing society with fewer young people, smaller families, but also living longer with illnesses. And our parents, looking after our parents is going to be probably taking up a bigger chunk of our life than looking after kids.
But not only a bigger chunk of our life, but also potentially a bigger chunk of our money, because social care is phenomenally expensive. My grandma was in social care for a while, and that cost, I think, upwards of £2,000 a week. I mean, we were really lucky that it was a great care home, but it was really very expensive. So this inheritocracy, or this inheritance that we're sort of thinking about or might get, is that a guarantee?
No. It's really interesting. So when you look at the data, for not 80% of millennials think they get an inheritance, right? That's wild to me, right? And in fact, there was one interview that I did with a woman in the book. She was a lawyer, and she said, I'm not contributing to a pension because at the moment there's just so many outgoings and I can't afford to, but I know that my father-in-law, when he basically kicks the bucket, there's going to be loads of cash there. And I was like, wow, that shows tremendous faith in your marriage, number one, but also like that inheritance coming through, because there's no guarantee. And so one of the things that the book tries to document is that actually most people will not get cash when your parents die. It's the way our inheritance laws work, as I'm sure you know, is that you're taxed on it unless you give it earlier. And if you give it earlier, preferably before 7 years, it's a gift. And what's happened over the last, really from the 80s, but really focused in the 2010s, when this concept of the bank of mum and dad was starting to be labelled was that parents realised their kids at 30 needed the money, right, to buy a house. It was tax efficient to gift money and not wait when they died. So unlike America, where most people give money at the point of death, here we give money at probably the point of need and for tax efficient reasons. So if you look at the rates of inheritance tax, they're like 6% of estates pay inheritance tax, and it's mostly bad financial planning, right? So just 6%. And we know the super rich do trusts and all sorts of fabulous things, so they don't pay anything. So it's really sort of important to get our head around is the bank of mum and dad isn't inheritance quite often, it's gifting. And we know that money compounds. The earlier you get it, the better, right? So one of the things that I had a great conversation in the book with Otega Uwagba, who wrote a really good book about money. I don't know if she's a really good writer. And she said to me, the thing is that it's my friends that got this gift in their 20s that were able to buy a flat and then compound and buy a house and then buy a bigger house. And then by the time they hit their 40s, they don't need any more. They've had the early gift, the early investment, and it compounded with interest. And it's the ones that have to wait, potentially, for any sort of money that actually are disadvantaged. And you think, you're disadvantaged? You're inheriting money. But actually, there's a disadvantage getting that later. So there's all sorts of layers of nuance when we're talking about inheritance and when people are sort of getting money from their parents. But certainly, the later you get it. The average millennial will inherit around 60 to 63, Gen Z more likely 68, because as people live longer, that inheritance at the point of death will be later. And so it won't go on you, it will go on your kids, or maybe even your grandkids, you know?
Do you think this is changing our relationship with our parents then, or the kind of stages of life we have as well?
Yeah, so there's a whole chapter in the book about how basically I was able to rely on my parents for a London base, and therefore I didn't grow up for a long time. And I had a great time. I had a wild time in my 20s and early 30s. Didn't really think about adult responsibility at all. Indulged in this PhD that took me 3 years and then another 3 years to write a book. And again, I hit my mid-30s and I remember my dad sitting me down and saying, I think you better think about your future, which was really embarrassing because I didn't want to. And also he hadn't. I mean, he was a sort of rather bohemian sort of, wanderer all his life. And I did remember thinking, I've managed to have this indulgent, freedom-driven, fun kidulthood that a lot of my friends who didn't have a London base, they all got really serious jobs really early, like I did not. Or some of them were looking after their parents, sending money home, and I didn't have any of that responsibility. Now, the moment I really woke up was when my dad got terminally ill, and that care reversal process inevitably had to happen. And, he said to me quite brutally, I'm going to make this quick. And he said, I don't want you girls, because I'm one of 3, spending all your time looking after me. And, we did. We all took off. I took off 6 months of work. My other sister, she's a doctor, thankfully. That was hugely helpful and beneficial. My other sister, we all had to rally around and look after my father. And it was really horrific. And at the same time, I had a young son. And that duality of basically being confronted by life and death was like, okay, right, now I'm the giver and the carer rather than just the receiver.
Yeah.
And then during halfway through the pandemic, my mum moved in with us after my father had died. And, it coincided with me hitting 40. And it was like, oh, shit. Like, this was like another wake-up call of I am parenting my parents now.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I think we, particularly women, if you look at what's happened over the last 25 years, is we've never had so much freedom. We've never had so much freedom. Young women now are out earning young men in the major cities across the world. We're out educating men. We're more likely to leave home before sons. You know, when we talk about the bank of mum and dad or the hotel of mum and dad, sons get more than daughters, right? But I think women leave the home earlier because they know that at some point they are going to have to be a carer in whatever capacity they choose to. But we've had tremendous freedom. And I think that the wake-up call for me was I no longer have that freedom. I have responsibility of care. Now, there's all sorts of injustice and inequality involved in that. Of course there is. But I interviewed this woman from Mumbai called Alina in the book, and she said to me, she said, I can't even believe you're writing a book about inheritocracy or the bank of mum and dad. Like, why is this even a thing? Because, you know, in Asian culture, you know, she was saying, you know, it's expected. My father was saving for my wedding from the age I was born. My parents funded my education. Of course they did. You know, that they bought us our first flat and our in-laws combined, you know, of course. But then in 4 years' time, I'm going back to India and I'm going to look after not just my mother and father, but my in-laws as well. And we're all going to be living in a big multi-generational household, and that's just how it's expected. And I think one of the problems in the West is that comes as a massive shock.
Yeah.
and particularly for women that have had a lot of freedom. And I think motherhood has certainly came to a massive shock to me. What do you mean there's no maternity leave or infrastructure or childcare is, you know, basically wiping out my wages? What is this? I've been, you know, groomed on girl power and all sorts of gender equality narratives that don't actually work in the real world.
Yeah.
Damn. And it's the same with elder care, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's, there's lots of bigger conversations we can have about that. But I think I wanted to not just talk about the money flowing down the family tree, but the fact that the care is going to have to flow upwards. And it can't just be daughters, it has to be sons as well. And actually, one of the positive stories in the book is I interviewed a lot of young men looking after elderly parents. And there is signs that sons are beginning to do a lot more on the care front of the elderly than as much as daughters.
So is inheritocracy and the kind of changing, shifting culture really shaping gender roles as well then, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've pointed to the sort of gender imbalance, the gender pay gap when it comes to inheritance. Sons get more. I think
But also that women own a lot more wealth because they tend to outlive their husbands on the whole.
Yes. And I think there is, one of the things that's happening is it's not just that, it's not just the bank of mum and dad, because quite frequently, you know, more often than not, dad dies before mum.
Yep.
And so it becomes actually grandma becomes this incredibly important economic force in the family. And now you're getting not just the bank of mum and dad, the bank of grandma and granddad.
Yeah.
You know, around 28% of grandmas and grandparents have funded first-time buyers in this country. So you're getting, this is generational now. You're getting the inheritocracy play out in across multiple generations.
Yeah, my friend's just put down a deposit from her grandma, so yeah, it really speaks to.
And I think if the patriarch dies, you get the gender transfer of wealth before it goes down the family tree.
Yeah.
And you know, it happened within my family. My father died. My parents had been very savvy when it came to property in the 80s, and my mum inherited it all. And it was really interesting because although she'd been a female breadwinner, she'd always made joint financial decisions with my father. And then she became this, like, you know, mummy dollar bucks, you know, she was like, okay, I have all the financial power. I've never had that before. Right. Who needs a house? I mean, you know, and actually she gave too much away, you know, and so it was like this really weird kind of dynamic where suddenly we were looking after mum in terms of her doctor appointments and where she was going to live and all of this kind of stuff. But she was the economic powerhouse of the family. And that's now becoming increasingly common. I mean, I did a big report on wealthy widows. And I remember I interviewed one woman and she was like, it's great. Like literally, I've up until the age of sort of 73, I'd never paid a bill in my life. And she'd been this sort of wayward sort of, you know, model in the 60s and met her husband in the Caribbean and, you know, he'd paid for everything. And she'd suddenly found herself with all this money and all these problems, because when she kind of lifted the veil on, or her bank did rather, on her husband's finances, she found debts and all sorts of complications, all sorts of stuff she had no idea about. But also she was like, I bought a house he would have hated. I went on holidays he would never have come on. She was like, I am living my best life. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic for a generation of women who had never had financial empowerment.
And you've touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about whether inheritocracy is a UK issue or whether this is something we're seeing more worldwide.
Oh, it's completely worldwide. And for those that have the time and the patience, do read Thomas Piketty's Capital, because really that's the intellectual sort of brick of analysis and data and work that really, I think, points to this idea of the rise of the inheritocracy. We are seeing the biggest transference of wealth in human history. And there's always been inheritance. There's nothing new about the concept of, the rich have always always kind of, passed their money down. But what's specific about this is the economics of being young have never been more expensive. And that's the same in America. It's increasing now true in China. It's increasingly true, certainly, in different parts of the world. But also you've got that generational disparity with that concentration of wealth in the older generations. It's slightly different in China. It's more Gen X rather than baby boomers. It's slightly different in the US, where you have higher wages, slightly more affordable housing, but not in the cities. There's national nuances and differences, but we are seeing an increasing importance of that inheritance being the definer of opportunity globally for the young, for sure.
And I'm quite conscious that, we're both white, self-defined, middle-class women. Is this something, or is inheritocracy a very different thing for other communities and other cultures in the UK? Or is this, something that is very specific to, upper and middle classes?
It's a really good question, because I would say up until the point my father died, I never would have said I was middle class, right? Which is odd, because obviously with 3 degrees, there's a certain degree of, entry into the middle class. I grew up in a very working class, culturally working class household. My grandfather won our house in a card game and put the deeds to the house in my grandmother's name, so he couldn't bet them again.
Smart man.
And and as I say, I was the first person in my family to go to get a degree. And what is critical in this, weirdly, is if you'd have asked me 15 years ago, I'd say I was culturally working class, whatever that means. And you do get this. There's a brilliant academic survey that analysed people that were first-time buyers who'd had help from mum and dad. And the commonality when they described their story and their help from their parents was not the opportunity that they had had, but how hard their parents had worked.
Yeah.
So now people will defer to their parents' working class roots rather than their middle class status.
Oh, it's definitely
right?
something I'm guilty of as well,
right.
100%.
So actually, it's not, I think, easy enough to say, particularly because the Thatcher period in this country was determined by a lot of working class people getting on the housing ladder. It's not easy to say, oh, it's all middle class people that have inheritance or gifts, because actually it's not. There's a lot of working class families that have assets that have passed that down. So there's a big discussion in the book about class, but obviously it's most predominantly in middle class families. And it's interesting, if on our data that we were asking people, do you think you are reliant on the bank of mum and dad? And do you think we live in an inheritocracy? In all of these conversations, the one demographic that didn't want to admit publicly to their friends that they were reliant on the bank of mum and dad were men in London earning over £100,000. And that's, I think, quite obvious as to why that is that perception of I should be able to self-fund my family. I should be, I've on paper made it.
Yeah.
When in actual fact they can only live in wherever they're living because they've got parental help. But to your point around sort of diversity and how important that is, because I think one of the things I wanted to demonstrate in the book was the breadth of attitudes and experiences. So if you look at the hotel of mum and dad, for example, where is it most common? In the Bangladeshi community, right? Where it's a social expectation, if you like, almost, but part also economic constraint that you live at home for a lot longer of your early adulthood. If you look at, for example, which demographic is most open around talking about money inheritance, it's in the African community, where they have culturally a very different kind of expectations and openness around talking about money. Where is it least talked about? White British community. So I think there's differences around culture, but then there's also the economic disadvantage of being first or second generation immigrant.
Yeah.
And I think that's really something that I tease out in the book, where in many instances, if you have an economy where the state is withdrawn, the market's dysfunctional, but the family step up, quite often that economic dynamic favours kind of first or second generation immigrant community that are more family centric because they are economically and quite often culturally forced to be that entrenched, if you understand what I'm saying. So when I was speaking to Itega Uwagba, she was saying, everyone assumes that, my family is socially mobile because I'm, second generation immigrant from Nigeria. But she was like, actually, both my parents are university educated. They experienced downward social mobility when they came to the UK. We lived in Peckham, but I got a scholarship to a private school. And then I went to Oxford and, firmly entered the literati of the English middle class. And she was like, this is where the nuance of these conversations are really important. And I would take that even a step further and say, every family is different, right? I mean, I spoke to a guy in the book who both mother and father were alcoholics. He came out as a gay man to them in his teens and got kicked out of the house. He returned when his mother was terminally ill and looked after her. And when his mother died, she had a life insurance policy that she had basically got out and basically stipulated that her husband wasn't to have any of it and it was just for the kids. And so he inherited a large amount of money, but a large amount of money that came with huge complications emotionally. It wasn't as simple as, I'm quids in, and it never is. And there was countless stories in the book where, whether you're a product of a divorce or a blended family, families are about control quite often, about emotional complexity, difficulty, however happy your family is. When you kind of, rivalry between siblings, it can be incredibly messy, which is why inheritance disputes are up.
Yeah.
And why it's not as easy as saying you're a Nepo babe. I mean, look at the Beckhams. Yeah. Look at the Beckhams and the Pelts. I mean, I'm fascinated by that dynamic because clearly, the Pelts are far richer than the Beckhams, and he's chosen, the Pelts. And it just sort of indicates, I think, a broader point is that actually quite often a gift from your parents doesn't come unconditionally.
No, there's strings attached.
There's strings attached. Yeah. And I think one of the really interesting indicators of that is the number of millennials that are living near and nearer their parents, or often the maternal parents. But it's like, here's the deposit for a house, but you're living within 2 miles of where we are.
Yeah. One of my friends, they bought a flat, I think 3 doors down or something, so they could be nice and close.
Yeah. Here's a deposit for a house, but that spare room's mine.
Yeah.
It's all very conditional. Again, fair, you could argue, but let's not confuse the language here. Is a gift unconditional? I'm not sure it is. So I think I wanted to just kind of looping back on your actual question is, yes, I'm not just white, female, and yes, middle class. I'm also from London. Like, this is not just a London story, but London has a unique story because of the housing market. But I talk to people all around the UK because I wanted to, and from all different backgrounds and actually experiences, There's a guy in there that did have a gift from his parents, but his parents charged him interest and he had to pay the gift back. I speak to a woman who had a joint bank account with her mother because they managed property together, but not a joint bank account with her partner because she was a product of divorce and wanted financial independence from a man, but financial dependence with her mum. So, you know, it's the range is what fascinated me, because I could selfishly write a book that was trying to explain my life story, but also like wildly fascinated by how other families were having how these dynamics were playing out.
So if each family is different, how or what policies can be put in place, or how do you sort of change the social inequalities that are being created if each situation is so unique? What would you like to see?
Brilliant. So you've highlighted the major flaw of the book. Thank you. And I think the major flaw of the book is the question is the one I don't answer, which is, what are we going to do about all this?
Yeah.
And I don't answer it. I dodged it because it's really complicated, and I had a deadline. But I think the point I wanted to highlight was, we need to talk about this. This is the hidden force that is playing out in your friendship groups, in your family, on your street, in your workplaces. Let's see the hidden force and why it's come about. The next stage is, what can we do about this? Is reforming inheritance tax really going to work? No, I don't think it's going to solve the major issue. Is building more houses going to work? No, because what politician is going to build enough houses that values on homes depreciate?
Yeah.
You know, no, and also no one's going to vote for a party that basically depreciates homes. You know, is taxing wealth not going to work? Not entirely, but it's a start. I think it's really important that we realise, even last week, the degree to which wages are taxed, unlike wealth, and that's a generational divide. Of course it is, for obvious reasons. But all of these things combined, it's not just one policy. I had Gary Stevenson. Does everyone know who Gary Stevenson is? Yeah. Come to tea. He came to tea at my house. It's going to be on Channel 4 next year. And we talked about the wealth tax, and he's very sort of very committed to this idea that the solution is taxing the ultra wealthy and those worth over 10 million pounds. Now, it's important to recognise that on that basis, he's on the very core fact of there are too many ultra high net worth individuals, in his view. He's right. The biggest growth spurge in the last 30 years has been in the ultra high net worth bracket, right? And what's happened to the middle class is that it's declined in terms of the proportion of GDP, household wealth, sorry, not GDP. So you're getting a squeeze on the middle class, just like you've had a squeeze really from the 1980s on the working class, right? They don't own as much. Their share of the house national wealth is shrinking. But the key thing is his solution is tax the wealthy. Now, I don't think that's big enough. I don't think it's ambitious enough. I don't think that's actually going to solve the issue. It's a really great clickbait campaign, but ultimately, we're, as a country, and just to localise it within the UK for a moment, we are running a national debt that is costing us billions a year just to even service the debt, and so we have to work out as a country, what is it that we're prepared to tolerate? Are we prepared to tolerate getting rid of the triple lock? Are we prepared to tolerate no stamp duty for pensioners so that they downsize? 50% of baby boomers live in houses with 2 spare rooms that are maybe occupied at Christmas. What are we prepared to tolerate is, I think, the conversation we need to be having. And how do we make it in an ageing society where who votes are the older demographics, and therefore who are the policies in this country serving? The older demographics. Yeah. And that's only going to increase because we're an ageing society in which we're having fewer children, and the demographics are ever going to be more skewed towards the older demographic. So how do we make it more affordable to be young and actually therefore make inheritance matter less is the bigger question, rather than let's tweak this inheritance tax policy here, let's put a tax on this and da-da-da. I think, reforming council tax, all the things, making an education system that doesn't, force you into this one kind of avenue and make you think it's the only thing you should focus your life on for the first 20 years of your life. It's madness. We've created an exam system in which you cannot fail. It's no wonder we're all suffering from burnout by the age of 30, because we're pushed into this sausage factory that we can't fail at, because then it's like the end. So it's like all the things is what I would say. It is like, and I liken it to the conversation that Britain had in the 1940s in the aftermath of peace after the Second World War, is what is this country capable of funding, and what does it want to concentrate on? And then it was the NHS, and then it was, you know, a universalised education system, and et cetera, et cetera.
So before I open up the floor, I just have a very selfish question, which, as a millennial, and millennials famously love brunch, where's your favourite brunch place in Tooting?
Oh gosh, oh God. So the Antelope pub is really good.
Yeah, I've been there.
Do you live in Tooting?
No, my brother used to live in
Okay,
Tooting.
right, so
I'm a
the
big fan of the
Antelope-
Green Monkey. Is my
Green Monkey, where's
just
that?
by Tooting Beck.
Okay,
Yeah.
yep. I would say anywhere in Tooting Market is really good. There's a new Italian restaurant that's
try
opposite
it
the
out.
organic wine. I mean, it's so shishi now. The gentrification of Tooting is something that I saw happen. And again, it was one of these places that no one wanted to live, and, you know, was full of, you know, really not cool gentrified places for brunch. And the local pub, the Antelope, used to have a collection tin for the IRA at the end of the night. It was a very different place. And I saw, with that gentrification, critically, my parents' assets appreciate, and me unable to afford to live in the place I grew up. Yeah. But now I love going there for brunch.
So yeah, happy to open up the floor to questions, because I'm sure other people want to come in on this. So
I've seen your posts on social media talking about the Inheritocracy and Rory Sullivan's comments on your book. How do you find the social media personality side of being an author and a historian in 2025?
Great question. I mean, I think it's a work in progress. I mean, I'm such a geriatric millennial. I'm sort of like a bit shocked and paused when I put the camera to my face. I think it's not a question I've ever been asked, so thank you for asking it, because I don't think I've got an answer. I think when you are writing a book, the best thing you can do is shut off the entire world and work out what it is that you want to say. And I did that for 8 months while I wrote this book. Luckily, I had a team pushing out things at the same time. But in the last 18 months, I've been out there promoting the book, retelling the book, you know, to an exhausting level. And I love seeing people respond to it. I love getting the comments, rude or otherwise. I love hearing what people think about it, what they disagree, you know, all of that. And actually, as an author, that's surely the whole point. And I love the fact that social media gives me that immediacy and gives me that kind of feedback loop. I think one of the things that I struggle with, and we're trying to do something about this right now on YouTube, is longer form content. Because I find doing a 1 minute 30 video the most frustrating thing ever. I love Substack because it's the most sort of creator-led platform, I think. You know, there's no word limit. You can literally write about anything. You know, some of it flies, some of it doesn't. So I love Substack. I have a problem with TikTok because it's so random. The comments on TikTok are just so random. None of them make sense a lot of the time. Instagram I find is a really nice community, and I get a lot of interesting, sometimes repeat sort of comments from same people giving me feedback. I think that it's a real gift to be able to share your work in a way that we can these days. And I think I spent years in academic training. And actually one of the things that I'm trying to do is untrain myself in all of those habits, because it doesn't make for good communication and good storytelling. So one of the things that bear with me if you do follow me on Instagram, is I'm trying to learn how to be better at kind of creating content that people respond to. But that's sort of a bit of a journey for me, because I grew up in the academic sort of, everything's a discourse, talking a language that actually people find alien. So I'm quite excited about learning and being a student of that, really.
I'm going to take a question from online because it came in quite early. So it's an anonymous question. When you say we know that model is dead in relation to working at one company for life, why is that? Is it people want more? The offering at companies is different. And at law firms, we do see people who work at one firm for life. What's the difference?
I think that's a great question. I think actually law is probably one of the exceptions where people will stay at a firm or will stay in a career for life, partly because of the financial rewards. You get used to the money. But I think genuinely that it is there's also variety, there's also progress, there's also, a path to mastery. I think, I do think though that the move, what happens when you are raised on the algorithm is that you are very, self-centered. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just saying that you've ever picked up anyone else's phone? It's an alien world. Like nothing makes sense. Like, and it speaks to the fact that we have all become very individualistic and have a real sense of our own, not just our self-importance, but our journey through life. And this is something I'm quite fascinated by, is that, so much of being young in the 21st century is about realizing of the self. This is my identity. This is, whatever it is, my gender identity, my sexual identity, my workplace identity, my cultural identity, whatever it is so much of life now is about going on that journey and having multiple chapters, eras. Thanks, Taylor. So I think we are in a cultural moment where people see their life in eras, and I think that's really exciting, and I think it's really empowering. I think it's a ball ache for companies, right? Because how do you give people eras in their career? You probably can, but you need to sort of make the journey much more sort of less rigid than it currently is.
Another question from online, Pankaj Kapoor. He says, very interesting session, thank you. Is there a view you would have on those with non-inherited pathways who have been successful?
Yeah, this is one of the questions I wanted to answer in the book, is who's made it, quote unquote, that's all relative, without the bank of mum and dad. It's mostly those not in a big city, particularly not in London, even actually not in the southeast. Those particularly, and I'm going to say it, men who did STEM subjects and found a good employer. That was the commonality. And also were in dual income, not single income households. So we know that 70% of millennials are in dual income households. You need, frankly, 2 incomes to create the kind of wealth that 1 income made 30 years ago. But that obviously is complicated if you have children or elderly parents to look after. But that was the thread, was though they didn't live in London or the southeast, they didn't do humanities subjects, much to my dismay, and there was another factor as well. They had multiple streams of income. And one of the things, I've just started writing for The Times, and the first article was on Gen Z and investment culture. And one of the big ticks upwards that you've seen in the last 5 years is young people investing. Because what they're essentially realising is that you cannot live by wages alone. And you certainly can't build wealth by wages alone. You potentially can't even build property wealth by wages alone. So that's quite interesting as well, is that sort of really sort of financial savviness around money was also another thing that was synonymous with those that didn't have the bank of mum and dad.
Thank you. That was a really great talk. I think when I first saw the title of the book, the word that came to my mind was actually hypocrisy, which love a wordplay. But just to explain a bit about me, I think it was relevant for my question. So I'm a millennial, younger end, boomer parents, 60s, granddad pushing 100. So I just was really interested in what you said about the kind of generation before the boomers, and I think they're called the silent generation, and kind of how that links to this sort of protection of wealth in potentially the boomer generation. and I'm not a boomer, so I don't want to speak for them, but I'm just interested for your thoughts, really, where there's this potential sense of responsibility upwards and downwards, and sort of how that then plays into, I need a house with 4 bedrooms, and maybe that's why I should hold on to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And we were doing a session before this one, actually, with seniors in the business. And one of the things that was clear was there was a lot of people in that room nodding when I said there's an emergence in midlife of the squeeze generation between those that have elderly parents to look after and kids. And when I say kids, quite often young adult children still living at home. And so you have seen an uptick rise of multi-generational households, Gran-X's, for example, that sort of is rising in the US and the UK. It's declining, interestingly, in China and India, where, you know, traditionally it was expected, socially expected. I think it's become economically sensible. It's also become, you know, sensible in terms of care, because quite often the grandma would look after the kids, and then, frankly, also the kids and the parents then look after grandma. I think it's how we used to live. You know, also there's a sort of weird return when to how we used to live when we talk about multi-generational households. I think the what's interesting to me is that squeeze is disproportionately impacting women in midlife who may be facing, you know, the menopause, may be facing, you know, career challenges, struggles, and that squeeze of looking after adult children and funding and doing elder care is really, really, really challenging. And was particularly challenging during COVID. And if you look at all the data, who was the most burnt out during COVID, it wasn't Gen Z, it was Gen X women. And millennial women will have that squeeze as well if you have kids. You know, just be aware, it's coming. And I'm sort of living it now. I had it when my father was ill, and now I have it with my mum. You know, my sisters and I have this WhatsApp group where it's mostly, I'm worried about mum. What's mum doing? What's mum doing about her health? What's mum doing about her knee? What's, you know, and so it's we've actually renamed the group, you know, worrying about mum, because it's all we talk about. So it is that squeeze where it may be an ever more extended part of your life as well. Because one of the things that is, as I said earlier, we're living longer, but we're living longer with illnesses to manage. And that could be, you know, a hip operation that you have to manage, but it also could be Alzheimer's. And those things are really complex, require a lot of care and a lot of attention. My grandmother was 76 when she died, and she just literally dropped dead of a heart attack. She wasn't ill, she just dropped dead. And now, you know, my mum is pushing 80 and has had multiple illnesses that we've had to help with her, you know, get her through. And I think that's just a natural consequence of how we're living differently. It should say anyone in this room that is under the age of 22, you have a 50-50 chance of living to 100. So, you know, like your grandma, that's a long life. That's a long life. You'll probably, you know, as I say, inherit around 68, pay off your student debt around 63, you know, buy your first house probably at 40, you know, pay off your mortgage around 70, you know, this is like, and then you've got like maybe 30 years where the aim really should be to be as healthy and as independent as you possibly can. But yeah, it's a really fascinating area for sure.
And on that welcome thought, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So thank you, Eliza, and thank you everybody in the room for coming, and for everybody online as well. Thank you. Cheers.